I think you need somebody there with an awesome experience.
This is the second and final video segment in our study of the passive voice, or the introduction to the passive voice in Chapter 24, Section 1. At the end of this week, the 6th week, you should be able to know, you should know the vocabulary in Section 24.1, and you should be able to do the exercises in E24.1, the ones that we didn't do in week 5. And you should begin to get used to translating the passive voice. I know that some of the discussion in our first video about the middle voice and the passive voice, and about the word deponent, and even perhaps these pages that I'm looking at and hopefully are also on your presentation are visible there, about the deponent voice, or the term deponent, are not so easy to understand. And I realize that, and you can address questions to the tutor, Masood, who will be able to help you. But we will be discussing the meaning of this word deponent and the application of it. And as we translate verb forms that are in the passive form, I think you will become more used to this whole discussion. Again, I will say that different teachers have different views of what deponency and what deponent means, and what it means that a verb may have an active or have a middle or passive form and be translated with an active voice in English. We will continue to discuss this. And I will give you my views, and you will hear other views. Dr. Campbell has a slightly different view, and other teachers have. This is an area of great discussion at this present time in New Testament Greek, and so it won't be surprising if you have some confusion regarding it. But I think your basic translation of the passive voice, that something happens to the subject, will generally be the case. I've been reading each morning in the Epistle to Hebrews in Greek, and most of the forms that are in the passive voice, or passive participles, for example, are truly passive forms. Something happens to the subject rather than the subject acting. Now, I have not really discussed the contractions that take place with the different consonants at the end of verb stems. You will notice here in this page in front of you how these passive forms sometimes take place, that what are termed as guttural consonants or labial consonants or dental consonants. You will not need to know those terms, guttural, labial, or dental, but it's not bad if you recognize them. It explains how, for example, the aorist passive of ago becomes inkthane. We don't pronounce the chi before theta as chethane, but simply as an N sound. Inkthane. theme. Ink theme. And he was led, or I, in this case, this is the first person singular, I was led. And there were other forms here. It shows how these forms came to be. Now, of course, we're learning now not only the indicative passive, but we will be learning in the second part of chapter 24 the other passive forms, the subjunctive passive, and particularly the passive participles. We need to know those because they are very common. So the passive voice is much larger than just the indicative passive that we have had primarily here in the first section of chapter 24. The other thing which is important for us to notice right now is that we come to the subject of principal parts. Principal parts are the first person forms of verbs that are used in the New Testament. And if we know the principal parts of certain primary verbs used in the New Testament, we can form every other verb form from those principal parts. You will see a chart just before the vocabulary list in vocabulary 24.1, and let me emphasize again, and now in week 6 you are expected to know all of the vocabulary here, not just the irregular aorist passives, but also the less frequently occurring irregular aorist and perfect passives that are listed here. These are very common, not only as forms here as they are shown, but also you'll notice he puts 4 plus, and 4 means 4 times in the New Testament, but when you add prepositions to the front of these verbs, then the plus means that there are many other forms of these verbs with prepositions in front. Aphiemi, and you may have aphiemi with the preposition epi added to it. And other prepositions may be added to the front of verbs. Apostello, or ekstello, or enstello, or I'm just mentioning different varieties, and so a verb form may not occur in itself in very many times, but if you add the ones with the preposition in front, then it becomes much more frequent. But back to the subject I want to emphasize here in this second and final video on chapter 24.1, and that is principal parts of some common verbs. You will be expected to know all of these principal parts, so you need to start memorizing these principal parts. There are certain principal parts that you must know. There are certain principal parts that you should know. There are certain principal parts that an A student must know. So we make a difference. We don't expect a student who is content or let's say struggles with memorization, may not be able to memorize all of the verbs and all of the principal parts, but there are certain ones that everyone should know, and these, for example, are those that everyone should know. Balo, and you'll notice that we are given all of the principal parts here. These are all the first person singular only, because we can form the other forms the second person singular and plural, the third person singular and plural, all from this first person singular if we know that form. So, for example, balo, I throw. We have the English simple gloss next to it, just to remind us of the meaning in English of the main meaning. Balo, I throw. And then the future, which we have not had yet, but for completeness is added here. We will soon add the future tense in coming weeks. Balo, and then with one lambda, balo, I will throw, or I shall throw. And then the aorist, ebalon, which is a second aorist. This verb only has a second aorist. And verbs either have a second aorist or a first aorist. Almost always they can't have both, they have just one or the other. So balo has a second aorist, ebalon, I threw. The perfect is bebleka, I have thrown. And we've had the perfect tense in chapter 21. Some are still struggling to learn the perfect tense form, so you need to review chapter 21. Notice that we don't have the imperfect because the imperfect is so easily formed from the present tense balo that it's not part of the principal parts. It's only the ones we need to know in order to form all of the verb forms that we call principal parts. So first is the present tense, balo, and then the future, balo with one lambda, then the aorist, the second aorist, ebalon, and then the perfect, bebleka, and then the passive voice forms that are listed last. The perfect and then the aorist. I think the perfect is always listed first because the perfect active, bebleka, is in the fifth column, and so in the sixth column they put the perfect passive next to it. So the perfect passive is beblemai. And the aorist passive of balo is eblethain. Notice the typical theta, eta of the aorist passive, especially the theta. Sometimes in the, particularly in participles and in other passive forms, you won't have the eta as you do in the aorist passive, aorist indicative passive. But typical for the aorist indicative passive is theta, eta. But if we remember that theta in particular is a sign of the aorist passive, it will help us in recognizing aorist passive forms. Eblethain, notice edothain, estathain, and these are all the first person singular. So eblethain, I have, I was thrown, the aorist passive. Edothain, I was given. This is always the first person, I. And the passive, aorist passive, I was given. Speaking of me, myself, I was given, and then presumably to somebody or to something. Perhaps I was given to the Lord, and so on. So, and some of them, of course, are irregular. You notice lego is a very irregular verb. The future is ereo. The second aorist is apon. We've learned that. The perfect is ereka. I have said. But the perfect passive it has been said, or sorry, I have been said, which actually makes no sense, and probably will not appear eremai, but the eretai, the third person singular, it has been said, might appear. Certainly the aorist passive erethen, I was said, in the third person singular will appear, it was said. So the aorist passive will appear. So if we know these principal parts of these verbs, the present, the future, the aorist active, the perfect active, the perfect passive, and the aorist passive indicative. These are all indicative verbs. If we know the indicative forms, principal parts, if we know these, we can form every verb form from them, and that's why it's important for us to learn at least the most common principal parts. So we will begin doing that with this lesson, and we will continue throughout now Greek 4, our final semester of Greek grammar, CRST 372 learning, and reviewing the principal parts of the most common verbs.